So welcome to HOMT 614 Hospitality and Tourism Strategy. Today is our 8th session, and we will continue with our discussion on external analysis, this time looking at the micro context. So in our previous session, we looked at the macro context and how to perform a macro environmental analysis to help us to be able to ascertain the nature of this context and how changes in it will affect our strategy formulation and implementation. So today we are looking at the micro context, which to some extent is a bit different from the macro context in the sense that we determined in our previous session with the macro context, we have no influence over it and we have no control over it. We can only respond to the changes that take place within the context, be it an opportunity or a threat. However, with the micro context, even though we do not have any control over it as well, we have some degree of influence over what takes place in that context as a result of the nature of the actors within that context. So today we will be looking closely at this context and how we can be able to respond to the changes that take place in that context by means of a micro environmental analysis. So as usual, at the end of the session, there are certain learning outcomes we hope to achieve. The first one is to be able to clearly distinguish between micro and macro level external analysis, and then to also be able to explain the importance of industry and market analysis with regard to the hospitality and tourism sectors. And then finally, to describe the construction and application of Porter's 5 forces framework to tourism and hospitality. Now, Porter's 5 forces framework is the main framework that we are going to use to help us analyze the nature of the behavior of actors within the micro context. So we will go in depth into the model, which was developed by Porter in 1980, I believe, to help us to dissect this environment and know how to be able to influence the behavior of actors in there somewhat, and then respond to the changes as a result of the behavior of the same actors. So let's begin by asking ourselves first, what is the micro environment? So the micro environment comprises the immediate industry environment in which the organization competes, cooperates, and buys and sells. Now, by virtue of these actions which the firm performs in this particular environment, we realize that it brings out certain actors that specifically engage with the firm in each of these actions. So when we talk about the organization competing, which group of actors are we talking about? When we talk about the organization competing, which group of actors are we talking about? Anyone?
So,
yes, Mercedes.
did you say the supplier?
Competing.
Okay, I think you should come again with the question. I think
if we talk about the organization competing in the industry, which group of actors does the organization engage with when it comes to competition?
Doc,
yes, Ruth.
Please, are you talking about the same people doing the same business?
Yes. What is the name we give them?
Competitors.
Competitors, Mercedes. So competitors, right? So when we talk about the organization competing, they are competing with competitors. What about organizations cooperating? Remember, Kwame mentioned this in one class in our previous sessions about organizations and actors that the organization cooperates with.
Oh, intermediaries.
Intermediaries, right? We can also call them collaborators because they work hand in hand with the firm to achieve the firm's objectives. Thank you, Kwame. Then when we talk about the firm buying, who will the firm buy from?
Certainly the suppliers.
The suppliers, because they'll buy certain resources that they do not have themselves to be able to enable them achieve their objectives. And then finally, when we say the firm is selling, who are they selling to?
Customers.
Customers. So generally, this is what happens in the micro environment. The firm competes, cooperates, and buys and sells. Now, Because of the nature of this environment and how close it is to the organization's activities, we sometimes refer to the microenvironment as the immediate environment or the near environment, or as some people will call it, the competitive environment. Because changes that happen in this environment, although the firm cannot control, have an immediate and direct effect on their activities as an organization. Hence the name immediate or near environment. So in that case, managers have to be aware of what is taking place in this environment, because unlike the macro environment, they cannot control it, but they have some degree of influence by which they can be able to influence the behavior of some of these actors in the microenvironment to get them to take certain courses of action that could favor the organization's cause. So understanding the microenvironment is very pivotal when it comes to strategic decision-making in organizations within the hospitality and tourism context. So now that we understand the microenvironment, let's try and understand the concepts of industry and markets. Now, you remember in one of our previous sessions, we tried to distinguish between the B2C market and the B2B market. And that is because the markets, as we refer to them in decision-making for organizations, refer to the demand side of the industry, which has to do with those who are requiring the services or the products of organizations in the sector to satisfy one particular need or want. So they constitute the demand. And in this case, we talk about B2C markets, where we have markets that consist largely of individual buyers. Whereas the B2B market consists of markets that largely are made up of organizational buyers. And as we learned in the previous session, organizational buyers have very different characteristics and needs and requirements from individual buyers. So in strategy formulation, when it comes to the microenvironment, firms, particularly in the hospitality and tourism sector, must be able to appreciate the nature of the demand for their products and services, particularly in terms of whether the demand is largely a B2C market demand or a B2B market demand, or a combination of the two, to enable them to strategize accordingly. Now, aside the markets, we can talk of the industries or the industry, which is centered around the supply of the product or service. So in this case, when it comes to the hospitality and tourism sector, the industry is made up of three main sectors that supply various products and services to satisfy the needs of customers in these markets we have talked about. And they include the tourism sector, the hospitality sector, and the events sector. So these three sectors come together to form the groups of organizations that supply the products or services in the hospitality and tourism industry. Now, as we have been able to surmise from this brief discussion we've had, each industry or industrial sector and market will have its own distinctive structure and characteristics. So that means that when the firm is formulating their strategy, they need to understand the unique structure and characteristics of these markets that we have just talked about, being the B2B and B2C markets, as well as the industry and how its various subsectors are structured, including the hospitality sector, the tourism sector, and the event sector. Without a firm understanding of these markets and the various sectors within the hospitality and tourism industry that serve them, it will be very difficult for the decision makers and organizations within the industry to formulate appropriate strategies that will work for the particular segments that they are serving. So it is important to understand the distinction between these two, being industries and markets, and their distinctive structure and characteristics to enable the firm to strategize accordingly. So with that, let's look at a typical example of an industry versus market approach to strategy formulation. This example is about TUI PLC, a vertically integrated European travel group. Now, when we talk about vertical integration, it is the opposite of horizontal integration, all of which involve the firm acquiring the control of certain number of firms in different capacities. So in terms of vertical integration, it refers to the firm acquiring businesses within the same production vertical. So within the same production industry, if you may, like the hospitality and tourism industry, where you have the company having control over different stages in the production or distribution of a product in that industry. So you can have the firm, for instance, in the hospitality and tourism sector, having businesses in the area of tourism, where they own some transport companies, where they own some travel agencies, and then in the area of hospitality, where they own some hotels, and then also in the area of events, where they own some event management companies or some event planning companies. This is an example of vertical integration. So you see the firm has interests in different stages of the production of the hospitality and tourism product. Whereas with horizontal integration, the firm is acquiring and controlling businesses, at the same level. Hence the word horizontal. So they are usually acquiring and operating a number of businesses in the same subsector. And they will usually do this by acquiring their competition. So you realize that an organization owns a number of hotels in different locations. This is a typical example of horizontal integration. So the example we are talking about in terms of TUI PLC is that of vertical integration, where they own different interests at different stages of producing the hospitality and tourism products, where they operate in the airline industry. They are also a travel intermediary, where they own a tour operator and a travel distribution company. And then they also own accommodation, so hotels. And then they also have interest in the cruising sectors, where they own cruise ships, right? And they also operate in different markets, being Scandinavia, continental Europe, the UK, and North America. So you can see that the firm is engaging in different subsectors of the industry, as well as engaging in different markets, which have been classified in this case geographically. And I'm sure in these geographical markets, they will also have interest in terms of the B2C market and the B2B market. Please, do we understand?
Sure, I do.
Okay, all right. So now that we've appreciated the nature of industries and markets and the concepts of vertical and horizontal integration, let's talk about some literature using the terms industry and market interchangeably. Now, you will realize that in certain literature that you will read, they would sometimes use markets when they are referring to industry and vice versa. Now, we are not saying that they are necessarily wrong. However, if we are looking at the analysis of an industry and a market from the dimension of formulating a competitive strategy, then we will be committing a great error if we confuse the two concepts together. Because in terms of competitive analysis and strategy formulation, we need to appreciate the different sub-levels of industries and markets as we have just identified to be able to come up with solid, effective, and efficient strategies that we can implement to achieve the sustainable competitive advantage that we are looking for. So modern organizations such as vertically integrated travel companies may operate in more than one industry and in more than one market, or vice versa. They may decide to operate in more than one industry in one market, or operate in one industry in more than one market. Please, are you getting where I'm coming from? So assuming we were using these two interchangeably, there will be no way in terms of competitive strategy to distinguish from those firms who are operating in more than one industry in one or more markets, or vice versa. Please, does that make sense?
Doc, please, can you repeat that particular statement?
Okay, so what I was saying was that sometimes you will see certain literature that use industry and market interchangeably. So in essence, they are saying the two words are the same. However, when it comes to competitive analysis and strategy formulation, it will be suicidal to consider these two to be the same, because it will be difficult to differentiate the firm's choice of strategy based on the nature of the industries they choose to operate in, whether they decide to be integrated vertically or horizontally, and the markets that they serve. And as we saw in the previous example, we could see that the firm decided to operate at different levels of the industry in different markets. But we could also distinguish between a firm that operates at different levels of the industry in one market. Is that possible? Is that possible? Based on the example we just saw. So they can operate a tour agency, they can have a cruise, they can have accommodation, all in the same market. That's possible, isn't it?
Oh, sure.
But assuming we were saying an industry and a market are the same, we can't make this distinction, can we?
Yeah, asking ourselves at what point in time do we use what?
So in terms of competitive strategy, you need to separate them.
Okay.
And look at it in terms of industries and markets. So in terms of the hospitality and tourism industry, we are looking at the various subsectors of the industry, being tourism, hospitality, and events. Are you with me?
We are with you.
Good.
Go ahead.
Then in terms of the markets, we are looking at the different geographic markets, as well as in terms of the B2B and B2C market. Does that also make sense?
Sure.
Good. So by making this distinction, the firm can be able to come up with a unique strategy by which they can achieve this competitive advantage that they are looking for. So you can have a firm that can decide that in terms of the industrial subsectors, they will stick to accommodation. And then in terms of the markets, they will stick to perhaps the B2B market in a particular geographic region, say Ghana or Europe. Please, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good.
So Doc, does it mean that the market is geographic? Like,
it can be geographic and also be in terms of the nature of the buyer.
Okay.
So here we are saying, for the purposes of the hospitality and tourism sector, we need to look at it both geographically and both in terms of the nature of the buyers to help us to formulate effective strategies. Because as practitioners in the sector like Kwame and Co will agree, serving B2B customers is totally different from serving B2C customers. And serving B2B customers from a particular region or country is different from serving B2B customers from another region or country. Likewise, B2C customers. The Ghanaian B2C customer will not be the same as perhaps the British B2C customer. So you need to look at all these things to be able to come up with a unique strategy based on your competencies and your resources as an organization. Jemima, I hope that makes sense.
Yes, please.
Great. So it is important that at all times we make the distinction between an industry and a market, and let that guide the nature of our strategic analysis and strategy formulation. So being that we have appreciated why we have to distinguish between these two, let's look at the relationship between a business organization, its industry, and markets. Now, in analyzing the industry and markets of an organization, it allows that organization to achieve a number of things. One being to be able to identify other industries where it may be able to deploy its core competencies. Or we can also say it can identify other subsectors where it will be able to deploy its core competencies. Because once you analyze the markets that you are serving, and you look at your industry and the various subsectors in that industry, you can be able to determine where your competencies can best be served. And that way, you'll be able to know where you can effectively compete based on the competencies that you possess as an organization. Also, you can be able to understand the nature of your customers and their needs. Like we just mentioned, if you are looking at markets in terms of the nature of your buyers, you know that B2C customers are different from B2B customers in terms of the nature of their identification of a need, how they go about finding products and services to satisfy these needs, and even how they go about deciding which product or service to purchase to satisfy this need. So by understanding the industries and markets that you are serving as a firm, you'll be able to understand the nature of your customers and what their needs are. Also, the firm will be able to identify new markets where its core competencies may be exploited. In as much as you are analyzing the market you currently serve, you do not restrict the analysis to those you currently serve, but looking at generally the markets that are served by the various subsectors in the industry that you operate in. So by doing so, you may be able to unearth new markets where your core competencies can be exploited to satisfy additional needs of customer groups in other markets that you are not currently serving. And that way, the firm can be able to expand its influence by utilizing its core competencies to serve other markets within the same industry. That is why we see examples like TUI PLC that have vertically integrated and are serving different markets with different products and services within the same industry, being the hospitality and tourism industry. Then we can also identify threats from existing and potential competitors in its own and other industries, because by performing the analysis of the industry and markets, you'll be able to identify those organizations that are also providing the same or similar services like you are. You will also be able to some extent determine the competencies that they have that enable them to provide products and services that may or may not be close substitutes to what you are selling. So that way you can be able to determine whether or not there will be a threat to your business operations in the short term or the long term. And that way you can be able to plan accordingly to see how you can be able to get them off your back or always be a step ahead to ensure that you maintain your position or your lead in the industry, whichever one it may be. So here is where we see a lot of the influence of the organization in the micro environment come into play, where you see that a lot of organizations within the sector who have a considerable amount of size and resources and therefore control a certain amount of the market are able to, in some ways, influence what happens within the market and how it affects other firms who perhaps may not be at their level in terms of resource and competence endowment. And that is when you see that we have the industry leaders controlling what happens in the sector. Like what we recently observed in the telecommunications sector, where MTN was largely dictating the pace for almost all the organizations in the telecommunications sector. Please, I hope that makes sense.
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Okay. So now that we've identified the benefits of analyzing industries and markets in which a firm operates in, okay, there was one more point. The last one was to be able to understand markets from which it obtains its resources. And here, the markets from which the firm obtains its resources has to do with the suppliers. Because you bear with me that the suppliers in a particular sector or industry do not serve only one firm. They serve a number of firms or organizations within the same sector or industry. And because of that, there is often competing interests at play, where each organization is requiring the same kind of resource from these suppliers who are serving the same competitors in the same industry. So you realize that again, here there is some degree of influence that the suppliers may be able to exert, assuming they have some degree of control in that perhaps that supplier is the only supplier serving all these competing firms, or That supplier is just one of many suppliers that are available to provide resources for all these competing firms. All of these have implications for the firm strategy formulation. And that is why we need to be able to understand these various actors and how they behave by means of the industry and market analysis. So as we have been able to appreciate why the industry and market analysis is a necessity, let's look at the process of achieving competitive advantage based on what we have discussed so far. Now, organizations will usually enjoy competitive advantage in the microenvironment by reference to one, other suppliers to the same market. One, other suppliers to the same market because, like I just mentioned, suppliers in the market have a high degree of influence on the nature of the output of the organizations operating within the market. Now, this influence becomes even more exacerbated when the suppliers are few, serving a large number of organizations, leading to high levels of competition for the same resources, which may sometimes affect the quality and nature of resources that the supplier is able to give to all these firms. So the organization's competitive advantage here being by reference to other suppliers is because if there are few suppliers in the market, it has implications for the organization's competitive position. And if there are a large number of suppliers, it also has implications for the organization's competitive position. Likewise, the existence of other organizations in the same industry. If these organizations, like we mentioned, are offering the same or similar products to that of the organization in question, then it has implications for their competitive position, because it means that the firm has customers who can obtain close substitutes to what they are offering at a whim, putting them in a position that is risky, because in the event that the customer decides to jump ship, there are various available alternatives that the customer can jump onto, right? And vice versa, if the organization does not have competing firms that are offering similar or close to what they are offering, it places them in some level of advantage in terms of their competitive position in the industry. Also, we can talk about the firm's competitive advantage being by reference to other competitors in the same strategic group. And when we talk about competition in terms of strategic groups, a strategic group is a competitive battleground determined by classifying companies with similar strategies. So if you have one or more companies that have a similar competitive strategy, they can be put together into what we refer to as a strategic group. So for instance, we can say that, yes, Mercedes.
I want to give an example.
Please go ahead and share.
I think the picture that is
Mercedes, please, you're breaking up.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm saying that PwC, KPM, Deloitte, and SLB, I think they are in the same strategy.
Yes, please.
Okay, all right.
Yes,
Thank
please.
you.
Right, because they have a similar competitive strategy, right? So yes, we can put them in the same strategic group. Very good example, Mercedes. So in terms of hospitality and tourism, we can talk about the fact that Lufthansa and British Airways are in the same strategic group, right? We can also talk about the fact that Southwest Airlines, which is a low-cost airline operating only domestic services in the USA, is in a different strategic group because they are domestic airline. So they'll be in the group with domestic airlines because they all have the same strategy. So in Ghana here, if we wanted to classify the domestic airlines into one strategic group, we will be spot on because they have the same competitive strategy. They all fly the same routes and their fares are virtually similar to each other, if not the same. Kwame, you wanted to come in?
Yes. Strategic competitive advantage, what we are talking about here is associated with a particular location or region. Is that correct?
The competitive advantage.
So we talk about strategic group, and
Yes.
We cited an example of the top four. So the top four, we are talking in association with a particular location or region. So for instance, when you come to the top to Ghana, the top four will work in Ghana, but probably in the US, the top four might not work there because they are they find that they could be possibly equally different companies out there also.
Yeah.
Please, do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. So that is when you are deciding to limit it to specific context or to specific scenarios.
Okay.
Right. So it's up to you.
I wanted to be sure.
Yes, so you are very right. It depends on how you want to go about your strategy formulation. So if you are looking at a particular geographic location, then you need to look at the organizations within that geographic location that have a similar strategy. Good. So Kwame, you are very right.
Sure.
Great. So these strategic groupings will also influence the process and approach that a firm adopts to achieving competitive advantage, right? So now that we have appreciated the sources of these competitive advantages and what it means to a firm to perform this analysis of industries and markets, let's go into the actual process of performing the industry analysis, right? So before we start, let's ask ourselves this question: what is industry analysis? So industry analysis here aims to help us establish the nature of the competition in the industry and the competitive position of the business within it. So by the end of the industry analysis, you'll be able to establish the nature of the competition in your industry in terms of the organizations that are competing, the customers that you are all competing for, the suppliers that are serving you all to enable you provide your products and services to compete effectively, and then the collaborators or the intermediaries that are helping you to be able to enhance your ability to compete effectively and establish this competitive advantage that we have been talking about. Now, once we understood what the industry analysis was about, we have to relate it back to the macro environment, because we remember in discussing the macro environment, we talked about the fact that the macro environment affects what takes place in the micro environment, as well as what takes place internally within the organization. So here it is important to appreciate the fact that industry dynamics and market dynamics are affected by changes in the macro environment, such that everything that operates at the macro level has an effect on the nature and the amount of change that takes place at the micro level in terms of the industries that the firms operate in and the markets that they serve. So for instance, if at the macro level, we have an aging population, like that of Japan, we realized that this will significantly affect the demand for hospitality and tourism products and the industry supplying them. And why are we saying this? We are saying this because when the population starts aging, there is growth, for instance, in the demand for cruises, which we know is very popular in Europe among the older aged population who want to relax and enjoy a life of leisure after all the hard work that they engage in. Also, it increases the demand for escorted coach tours. A lot of these older people engage in tours using buses around their countries and around their domestic regions to be able to familiarize themselves more with the area. Okay, so we were speaking on what industry analysis is about, and we said industry analysis aims to establish the nature of the competition in the industry and the competitive position of the business within it. So generally, it is about the organization identifying who their main competitors are within the industry and the markets that they are competing to serve, as well as the suppliers who are supplying them with resources, who they are competing or who they are all competing for to be able to get the best form of these resources to be able to serve the market that they serve, as well as the collaborators that they all collaborate with, often in the form of intermediaries, to be able to serve the markets that they are serving and achieve their objectives of gaining and maintaining a sustainable competitive advantage. So generally, we said that we need to appreciate the dynamics of the industry as it's influenced by the macro environment, because we learned in our previous session that changes in the macro environment come down to affect changes in the micro environment and how the micro environment operates, as well as changes in the internal organization, being the nature of the internal situation of the organization in terms of its resources and competencies, and how it can respond to these changes in the macro environment, be they opportunities or threats. So one typical example we can talk about in terms of changes in the macro environment that trickle down to the micro level and the internal level of the organization is the age of populations, which is a demographic variable, which we can discuss under the sociocultural environment. Now, in terms of aging populations, like as we observe in Japan, when the population begins to age, there is a certain change with regard to their demand for particular products and services. And when it comes to hospitality and tourism, the aging population tends to demand a particular kind of hospitality and tourism service that is geared towards leisure and relaxation. So you realize that the growth of aging populations around the world has led firms around the world to respond to this change in the macro environment by creating products and services that serve this particular consumer group, being the aging population. And some of these products involves developing cruises, which are well patronized by older generations, as well as escorted coach tours, which are also very well patronized by older populations, particularly in countries like Europe and Asia, as well as outdoor summer concerts, which are also very well patronized by the older generations and populations, as well as long stay hotels, where the older generation are usually accommodated to be able to get their needs met in the absence of their family members who are not always available to take care of their needs and wants. Then there are also the all-inclusive resorts, which provide all services, some of which are geared towards the specific needs of the aged population, including providing them with medical care, among others, right? These are all responses of the hospitality and tourism industry, to the trend of aging populations, which we are currently experiencing in different parts of the world, including in countries like Japan, like I mentioned earlier. So now that we appreciate what an industry analysis entails and how it helps us to be able to respond to the nature of changes in it that are being preempted by changes in the macro environment, we need to also appreciate the best way to go about performing this industry analysis. Now, to be able to appropriately perform this industry analysis, there are various frameworks and theories that have been developed. However, the most straightforward and most effective framework, which has been utilized for several years since its introduction in 1980, is what we refer to as Porter's 5 forces framework, which has been the pillar of industry analysis in various sectors and industries for several years. Now, the nature of this model enables firms to be able to conduct industry analysis consistently on an ongoing basis in an effective and efficient manner. Now, the key word here is ongoing basis, which we established when we were also talking about the macro environmental analysis. And we said that both these forms of analysis must be performed on an ongoing basis, simply because changes in the environment of the hospitality and tourism industry take place on a consistent basis. The environment continues to evolve by the second in this context, such that a particular analysis of the macro or micro environment performed at a particular time may not be effective the next moment in terms of strategy formulation, because certain factors may have changed, within the period that that analysis was done and when it is going to be utilized for the purposes of decision making. So if the monitoring is going on a consistent basis, the firm can be able to have access to information in a timely and relevant manner, such that they will be on time in terms of identifying specific changes, establishing how they are going to affect the firm and their ultimate strategy formulation, and how the firm should be able to respond in terms of how they go about designing their strategy. So we are going to assess Porter's 5 forces model and how it helps us to efficiently and effectively perform this industry analysis we are talking about, to be able to unearth the required information in a relevant and timely manner for the purposes of strategic decision making. Now, what is Porter's 5 forces model? It is a model that identifies the 5 competitive forces in any industry and helps the firm to be able to identify or determine the nature and degree of the competition in these industries based on the interaction between these 5 forces. Now, from the name, you can see that it does not make reference to any specific industry, because Porter's 5 forces is a generic model, meaning that it can be picked up and applied to any industry of interest, given that it has been designed to be able to address issues of a competitive nature across all industries. So for the purposes of the hospitality and tourism sector, we are using Porter's 5 forces model to dissect the nature of the industry and how competition within the industry takes place to enable firms to formulate their strategies accordingly. Now, firms need to be able to understand not just the interaction between the forces in the model, but also the nature of each of the forces independently, because their nature independently and how they behave determines how they interact with each other, as well as the outcome of this interaction between these independent forces. So it's important for the firm not just to focus on their interaction and what it leads to, but also the independent nature of each of these 5 forces. Sorry. And by determining the relative nature of these independent 5 forces and the power that they possess and utilize, which indicates the degree of interaction between them, helps the firm to be able to identify their position within the industry that they are operating in. Because by knowing how powerful each of the forces are and how the power that they wield determines how they interact with each of the other forces, you as a firm can be able to establish your position in terms of each of these forces and how they are interacting with each other, to identify where there are opportunities that you can take advantage of and where there are threats that you need to protect yourself as an organization from. So in that case, your strategy as an organization will be designed to be able to exploit each of these 5 competitive forces in terms of the opportunities that their interactions create for you and the threats that their interactions create for you to formulate a strategy that helps you to take advantage of the opportunities and overcome the threats as and when they present themselves within your industry. So this is the generic model of Porter's 5 forces. Now, as you can see, the major force is what we see in the middle, which involves rivalry among existing competitors, which is where you as the manager of a hospitality and tourism organization will find yourself, within the rivalry among existing competitors. Then on the periphery, we have 4 other forces. The first one being the threat of new entrants. Now, depending on the nature of the barriers of entry to a particular industry, the threat of new entrants into the industry may either be high or low. Next, we can talk about the bargaining power of buyers, which again, depending on the number and size of the buyers in the industry, their bargaining power may either be high or low. Next, we can talk about the threat of substitute products or services. Now, if the nature of the products or services within this industry are such that they are close substitutes for each other, their threat will be high. Likewise, if the switching costs among buyers of moving from one competing firm to a competing firm that offers a substitute is low, that also creates a high level of threat for firms operating in the industry. And then lastly, we can talk about the bargaining power of suppliers, which has to do with the size and level of control that suppliers have over key resources in the industry. If they have a high level of power and control, then they are a huge threat to firms in the industry, and vice versa. So now that we know each of the forces, let's take each of them one after the other and dissect them as they relate to the hospitality and tourism sector. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these are the 5 forces, and we are going to look at how they interact with each other, starting from the threat of new entrants to the threat of substitutes, to the bargaining power of buyers, or in this case, customers, to the bargaining power of suppliers, and then finally looking at the rivalry among businesses in that order. So let's start with the threat of new entrants. Now, the threat of entry to an industry by new competitors, like I mentioned, depends upon the height of the number of entry barriers. So if there are very few entry barriers such that it is very easy for a firm to enter into a particular industry or sector, then their threat is very high. However, if the height or the number of barriers are many, it will make it difficult for new entrants to just enter the sector or industry willy-nilly, and therefore their threat will be reduced. Now, when we bring it home to the hospitality and tourism sector, we realize that the barriers differ depending on which part of the hospitality and tourism sector you are looking at. So let's look at a typical example of a subsector in hospitality and tourism and consider it in terms of the threat of new entrants. So for example, the capital cost of starting a hotel are high. True or false?
Extremely true.
Please, what are some of the factors that make it high? Just a few. Can we talk about just the infrastructure alone?
Sure. Let's first of all talk about land tenure system, especially location.
Good.
Location.
Exactly.
Is key.
Yeah.
Now we'll talk about utility, because where you're going to locate, do you have water and lights? Do you have telephone?
Exactly.
Then you look at the market. Is market available? Yeah. So these are the 3 immediately I'll be able to put across.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Kwame. So you realize that based on just the little that Kwame has told us, the costs are indeed significantly high. But let's look at another subsector like the event organizing subsector or the travel agency subsector. Definitely the entry barriers are low, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's very easy for people to wake up one morning and say, okay, I'm an event planner or I'm an event organizer.
Sure. I knew Mercedes will come up.
Mercedes, please go ahead. Mercedes, please go ahead. Tell us.
Honestly, Mercedes, let me punch you quickly before you come. You don't need a particular location. You can do that in your home. You can start an event organization in your home. So Doc, let's continue.
Right. So this is just simply straightforward, right? We have been able to clearly establish this threat of new entrant situation. Yes, Ruth.
No, I don't like it when you help Kwame to come at me. I don't like that.
Oh. Oh, Ruth, it's unintentional. Please, I apologize.
No, it's not fair. You understand? It's not. Kwame, be careful. Why?
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So like we mentioned, depending on the nature of the barriers, whether they are high or low, there could be a huge threat of new entrants or a virtually non-existent one. So some of the potential entry barriers could include the capital cost of entry, which we've just talked about, the brand loyalty and customer switching costs. If it is very easy for customers in the sector to move around without any significant cost implications, then the threat of new entrants will be very high. Also, economies of scale or scope available to existing competitors. If the existing competitors are already sharing some economies of scale, it will be very difficult for a new entrant to come in and get a stronghold in the sector. So definitely the threat of new entrants in this scenario would be very limited. Also, in terms of access to inputs and distribution channels, if the existing competitors have monopolized or have absolute control over the access to inputs and distribution channels, then the threats of new entrants will be significantly low. Likewise, the resistance offered by existing businesses. If existing businesses would usually put in place significant barriers, which will pose significant resistance from the entrance of new firms to try and get them to not be able to have a foot in the industry, let alone come and get a stronghold, then definitely the threat of new entrants will be low. And I heard an interesting story about this that happened in the telecommunication industry some years back in terms of how MTN managed to stop Glo from getting a stronghold in the Ghanaian industry. And I thought it was a phenomenal approach that MTN used. Now, it is alleged that before Glo came into the industry, MTN has this strategy of not letting them get a foothold and creating a mirage for MTN, for Glo to think that they are actually doing very well. So what MTN did was, when Glo started with their publicity and started floating their SIM card for purchase, MTN went on a hyperdrive and began purchasing all their SIM cards. So in Glo's mind, they are selling a lot of SIM cards, but they were actually generally being bought by the #1 competitor in the industry and being warehoused. So usually the benefit of selling a lot of SIM cards is that after the SIM cards are sold, you realize that people will start buying airtime and using the SIM card, and then that is what will determine how well the telecommunication company in question is doing. But after selling all those SIM cards, nothing happened. So Glo, even though they were putting a lot of money into the system in terms of celebrity endorsement and adverts and all that, was not yielding the returns that they expected, because one particular organization that had a large amount of control in the sector had put up a huge amount of resistance to prevent this new entrant from getting a foothold into the industry. So that's a typical example of how resistance from existing firms can stop new entrants from coming to compete in the industry. Kwame, you wanted to say something?
I was only going to say that indeed, this allegation somewhat has proven to be true, because when you look at Glo's performance in the industry, I mean, it's nothing to write home about, especially in Ghana. It's so appalling.
Yeah.
If you are a worker at Glo, I don't think, especially a Ghanaian, and probably you are a middle level, it will be very difficult.
That's true.
I don't know whether they are making it.
That's true. That's true.
But on the whole, my question is, is it a good strategy? This is an allegation.
Yes, it's an allegation. It's completely alleged. It could have been fabricated by Glo to cover their inadequacies and inefficiencies and blame it on the #1 industry player.
Things we do in business.
Yes.
Success sometimes. When you listen to a success story of people, I mean, behind the scene, it's crazy.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Exactly. Right, and finally, the threat of new entrants could also be as a result of government regulation, right? Recently, again, in the telecommunication industry, government tried to take out the #1 competitor in the industry, purportedly because they were having too much control of the market share in that industry, which was not auguring well for the development of that particular industry and the subsectors in the industry. So government put in place regulation to try to limit their control. So if government regulation in that regard had been successful, then it means that the threat of new entrants would have been imminent, because then government would have made it possible for other firms to effectively enter the market and compete, given that their regulation has limited the influence of the number one firm in that particular industry that had that amount of control over the industry, right? Anyway, how did that end up? The regulation to reduce MTN's market share, has it stalled? I think it has stalled, because I don't hear any more talk of it.
There was a lot of backlash from consumers and even the publics.
Yeah.
The fact that government wanted to put in place something like that, I mean, it didn't allow a free market economy.
Yeah,
But,
that's true.
To say this, you see, how do you call it? Monopoly sometimes doesn't allow one to grow, because you don't think outside the box. If you don't take care, because you are enjoying it all alone,
yeah,
you end up at the end of the day not coming out with new things. It's a subject of debate though. But let's say you are the only person in the market, and anybody that comes, you try kicking out the person. What new thing do you do?
Yeah.
But when you face competition,
yeah,
okay, when you face competition, you look into other things and you're able to position yourself properly.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. So those are some of the potential sources of entry barriers and the potential determinants of how high or how low the barriers of entry to a particular industry might be. In this case, the hospitality and tourism sector. Now, beyond the threat of new entrants, we can also talk about the threat of substitute products. Now, when we say a product is a substitute, it means that that product meets the same needs as the product of the industry, and this may be either direct or indirect. So if we say a product is one substitute of another product in the same industry, we mean that they help the customer to satisfy the same need, either directly by using the same means or indirectly by using other means. Either way, they can get the customer to receive the same outcome that they are looking for. So for instance, a person traveling to Kumasi can either do so by VIP bus to get them to their destination, or by air, using perhaps Africa World Airlines. These are two different means. However, they help the customer arrive at the same outcome they are looking for, which is getting to the city of Kumasi in the Ashanti region. So we realize that these products provide the same benefits, right? Even though they are in different subsectors of the hospitality and tourism industry. Or if we are looking at them as independent industries, we can say they belong to different industries, because the airline industry is not the same as the ground transport industry. However, they help the customer achieve the same outcome. So in terms of the threat of substitute products, the extent of threat from a substitute will depend upon a number of factors. The first one being whether the price and performance of the substitute can match the industry's products, right? So any product that is a close substitute will be a serious threat. But if it is not a close substitute, then it will not necessarily be a serious threat. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's compare the example I just gave. In terms of traveling to Kumasi using VIP bus and using Africa World Airlines. Are they close substitutes or otherwise? Before we answer that question, Mercedes, your hand is up. Please go ahead.
For the first,
Mercedes, please, I can't hear you.
hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I'm saying that I was just thinking about the example that you gave. Actually, I just wrote it down, and I'm thinking that well, let me give another example and see if maybe I really understand the substitute. Can
Yes.
we say fish milk?
Mercedes, we are losing you again.
Hello.
Yes, please come in.
Yeah, so I'm saying that can we say needle and peak milk?
Yes. Yes, they are very close substitutes.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. So in that case, like I mentioned, in terms of price and performance, traveling to Kumasi using VIP bus, right, versus using an airline like Africa World Airlines, would you say they are close substitutes or not? Kwame, please go ahead.
Okay, so Doc,
Yes.
they will be termed as close substitutes, but in this situation, there's a price difference.
Yes.
And so if, for instance, you don't use the airplane, or you don't use Passion Air or which hour,
Yes.
what you use is bus, but that comes with a price. That's the
Yes.
most important thing. It comes
Yes.
with a price. So
Yes.
as to whether you will be able to raise that if you'll be able to raise money to pay for the air.
Yes.
That's another thing.
Yeah.
Another thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So that sums it up generally. Right. But in the event that they were not close substitutes, we were comparing products that were not close substitutes to each other. Like, for instance, sleeping in a 4-star hotel and sleeping in a motel somewhere in Teshinungwa. Can we call them close substitutes?
Doc, what it is at the end of the day, do they serve the purpose for which you I mean, do they serve your common purpose? And that's the question I'm asking myself. So, for instance, you have a deadline to meet, say in Accra, and you're supposed to be accommodated, and you decide to go to let's say Campiski, while let's say Mensvik is there. Campiski is taking $1,000 per night. Mensvik is taking let's say $400 per night.
Good.
But the most important thing is your assignment is being met, or your deadline is being met.
Yes.
So either way.
But you see, we are just looking at it in terms of industry or subsector level.
Sure.
When we expand and take it into the market level, the dynamic becomes a bit different. For instance, if we were looking at the same thing in terms of B2B, here is the case: certain organizations have standing agreements with certain firms in different sectors, such that perhaps you are a B2B traveler and you are traveling in the name of your company, and your company has a standing agreement with Kempinski that whenever their executives travel to different locations, if there's a Kempinski there, that is where they must stay. That changes the dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
It does.
So that means that the threat of substitutes becomes low. Because the organization has a standing agreement with this particular service provider, and you cannot change that being an executive.
Absolutely.
On web.
Sure. I understand.
No.
Yes, Jemima.
I'm just thinking about your example about an airline and a bus.
Yes.
In terms of, I think that if in the scenario Kwame raised, if you have a deadline to meet,
yes,
I don't think they are substitutes at all.
But remember, Kwame also said in terms of price. So if you have a deadline and you can afford.
I'm looking at this. One time I missed my flight to Takoradi, and I had to go to Circle to get a bus. I got to Takoradi in the evening. Instead of 7:30 in the morning.
Yes.
So I think it's not just about even price, but if it can't help you get what you want achieved, then you can't compare it as a substitute.
Exactly. So when you bring in other variables, you realize that the dynamic changes, isn't it?
Yeah.
But when we look at it just generally, good. Right. So that's where the strategy comes in. Yes, Kwame.
No. So at this very moment, we are talking about the variables. We're not looking at the larger picture. Or
yes.
Okay.
Right. But when we start bringing in the little nitty, like Jemima is saying, the little nitty gritties, you were also bringing in an example like that. Like, so then the whole dynamic changes. That's the beauty of strategy. So if you are able to spot something that your competitor didn't see, that could be the whole basis of your competitive advantage. Does that make sense?
It makes.
Great.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Great. All right.
Hello?
Yes, Mercedes, please go ahead.
Yes, so without the example, something like passing air and then hour.
Yes, please.
There will be substitutes.
Yes, very close
But
ones at that.
Very close. Okay. So,
very, very close, because they do virtually the same thing.
Okay, so which means we are looking at the best of substitute products, depending on the variables that we are looking at.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Yes, exactly,
All right.
Mercedes. All right. Okay. Now, still on the extent of the threat of substitutes, again, we are saying it will depend on the willingness of buyers to switch to the substitute. Like Jemima was saying, after she missed her flight, she quickly went to Circle and went to take a VIP bus. Ladies and gentlemen, there are some people who will never be caught dead in a VIP bus or a shortfall. If the airline is not flying today, they will wait until the airline is flying.
Me.
Madam, that day, I was more than...
They will never be seen anywhere near a lorry station.
I tell you,
President, please go ahead.
In fact, Doc, like what happened to me, I was supposed to travel to Kumasi, and the client actually is the client that pays for meetings. So we were supposed to go by air, but I think it was the Hamatan time. I think January or February or something. So because of that, the airlines were not moving. So I mean, we had to go and do the job. So we decided to use the VIP.
Yes.
But when we were playing, I told my colleague that this thing, I'm not really happy about it, but the way I've seen the accidents and stuff from them, I'm not happy.
Oh.
You know, didn't get to any whatever. Then the bus decided to give up on us.
Oh.
Okay, that my colleague, I told him that, you know what, when we get to Smart, if you don't come by that one here, then I'll
You
send
sleep
Smart.
there.
So like you remember I saying, I think sometimes if you have something, we have to go. So we eventually, went. So
Yeah.
I don't know, Ghana, we should really think of effective ways to travel within cities.
That's true.
The fact that you miss, if a flight is from 7, take you 45 minutes to Takadi.
Yeah.
You don't have any option.
Yeah.
If you don't wait, if there's no flight that day, that means it's the next day.
Next day, yeah.
And if you try to get a bus, you get to Takadi in the evening from 7:30 in the morning.
I think the next best option was when they decided to start that railway system across Ghana. That is the next fastest alternative to air travel.
Yeah. Look, that will work. Yes. That will work. Let me just, that will work more effectively, considering the fact that rail is less expensive when it comes to you know, the average Ghanaian cannot make do with how they call it, air. Air is taking close to 400 cedis. I don't know what, and how many people can
someone's salary.
Yes, so many people can pay 400 cedis. And don't let us forget, you see, the kind of system we have, for instance, it's only Kumasi that is the next biggest city where a lot of business and activity goes on. Yeah. So if we are not getting close to about, let's say, 1,000 people in a day who are ready to fly that route, who do business, who want to return, how many times will our want to go there in a day?
Yeah.
So that's more like a factor. So until we open up business and the ordinary person is able to, get them the money to do, will be where we are.
That's true. Very true. And thank you all for sharing. Very enlightening discussion points. So in essence, if the customer is not willing to switch to an alternative, depending on the variables at play at that moment, then we can say the switching costs are high. But if the customer is willing at a whim to just switch to the next alternative, then we can say that switching costs are low, right? So now we've established the threat of new entrants and the threat of substitute products. Let's move on to the bargaining power of buyers. Now, buyers are arguably one of the most powerful actors in this particular context of the micro environment. And that is because they are the people who demand the products and services that are created in the micro environment by organizations through the resources obtained from suppliers by means of the competition that they engage in between themselves as organizations and with the help of the collaborators. So when we talk about the bargaining power of buyers, it is the extent to which these buyers or customers of the products or services that are sold in that particular industry exert power over the organizations that are supplying them with these products or services. Now, the bargaining power of buyers depends on a number of factors, including the number of buyers and the volume of their purchases. So bear with me that if we are dealing with an individual business customer versus a certain number of individual customers, based on the volume of purchases for a particular organization, the business customer may be giving the firm more revenue or income than a group of individual customers that they serve. So in that case, the business customer with the larger volume of purchases will definitely have more bargaining power than that group of individual customers. Please, does that make sense? Please, does that make sense?
No, please come again with that, please.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, please.
So in Ruth, what I was saying was in terms of the number of customers and the volume of their purchases, if I have a group of individual customers, say 10 of them, and they give me a certain amount of revenue, and I have perhaps one business customer, which is an organization, and they give me a certain volume of revenue, which in some cases is larger than all the revenue I get from these 10 customers put together, that business customer will have more bargaining power over me than those individual customers in that group of 10. Good.
Yeah.
Good, right? Hence, the bargaining power of buyers being dependent upon their number and the volume of their purchases. The bargaining power of buyers is also dependent on the number of businesses supplying the product and their size. For instance, like we saw in the telecommunication industry, there were very few firms operating in the telecommunication industry. However, there was one telecommunication company that was dominating in that industry, even though there were few. So in that case, the bargaining power of suppliers was very low because the terms in that market were largely being dictated by that particular supplier, which is MTN in this case. So they were determining a lot of the tariff rates. They were determining a lot of the changes and the nature of service delivery in the industry, even though they were just the market leader at that time. But because of their size, in comparison to the other firms operating in the sector, they were able to control largely what was happening in the sector, keeping them miles ahead of their other competition like Vodafone and Glo and Airtel Tigo, which is now government owned, right? So that's another means of bargaining power buyers. So we realized that when it came to what was happening in the telecommunication sector, we the buyers were just accepting what we were given. And today people are still not happy with MTN in terms of their poor services when it comes to calls and internet delivery. I am number one. I'm always having to swap between MTN data and Vodafone data, because sometimes MTN just messes up and you are teaching and your students can't hear you, right? And it's largely because of their sheer size in the industry and the fact that we as buyers just take what they give us. So we have low bargaining power. Also, using the same sector as an example, the bargaining power of buyers is largely dependent on switching costs and the availability of substitutes. Technically, no other telecommunication company can be deemed to be a very close substitute to MTN in terms of the services that they offer. MTN Momo is still the #1 market leader. Vodafone Cash has tried everything. they have still not been able to even come close to MTN Momo, let alone take them over. Tigo Cash, I think, is virtually dead. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Doc, you know, MTN Momo is now a company on its own.
Thank you, because of how big it has become.
Yes. So now they are far ahead, far ahead for any company to any competitor.
Let's catch up. So in this case, they are in the same sector, but MTN cannot. The other firms cannot be said to have anything that is even a close substitute to what MTN offers.
And look, the most interesting thing, just to chip in, the most interesting thing about MTN Momo is the fact that they are now even running a promotion, wanting you to lend money to you. This is interesting.
And they're also doing insurance.
Yes, and you'll be there. They are telling you that you should come and borrow. I mean, they can give you money.
Yeah, and now they've achieved interoperability. So if you're using MTN Momo, you can pay someone on Vodafone, and you can pay someone on Tigo.
Very interesting.
Kwame, how would the others catch up?
Not now.
So in this case, we as buyers have very low bargaining power.
Yeah.
They hold all the cards, right? So this is a typical example of how the bargaining power of buyers can be so low that we just take what we are given. However, it's not the same in every industry or subsector. In other industries and subsectors, it's totally different. For instance, when it comes to the hospitality and tourism sector, it is a totally different story. We cannot clearly see one organization dominating in any subsector. It's more or less somewhat of a fairly equal playing field for all the organizations in the different subsectors, such that even if you have some market leaders, it's not just one organization dominating everybody in their subsector. At least you have about 2 or 3 in the top competing for customers in that particular subsector, right? So still on the matter of the bargaining power of buyers, now that we've established how or what the bargaining power of buyers depends on, we need to appreciate the fact that the relative power of buyers is likely to be the strongest based on what we know when, one, there are few of them and they purchase large quantities, which we usually see in the case of B2B customers. There are not that many, but the volume of their purchases are so large that they often have a strong bargaining position when it comes to the firms they are purchasing from. We can also see the power of buyers when there are a large number of suppliers, because it means that there are so many people selling the same thing, all of them competing for the attention of a few number of customers. So the customers have room to dictate their terms to individual suppliers who, in some instances, may be desperate to keep them on as their customers and prevent them from switching to an alternate supplier. Right? So in that case, the bargaining power of buyers will be strong. Also, if the size of the buyers is large relative to the size of suppliers, so perhaps a buyer may not be an individual or a group of individuals, but it may be one particular buyer that is fairly huge and exerts a huge amount of influence in terms of their volume of purchases. And they are dealing with a supplier who is fairly small and does not have that much power. They will definitely have a stronger bargaining power over them. So if we have an organization that is making purchases, perhaps booking a trip for a retreat for their staff, and this is a large organization with a large number of staff, and they are dealing with a hotel, perhaps in one of the remote areas of Ghana, where they want to go and get some isolation, definitely their bargaining power will be high over this small hotel in this remote location they are going to. They can be able to have the power to dictate the terms that they want, in terms of how they want the rooms to be, how they want the place to be set up, the kind of menu that they want, among others. Unlike if they were dealing with an equally large supplier who could also dictate their terms, and then it will become more of a negotiation where each of them comes to some kind of compromise on what the buyer wants and what the supplier can deliver, right? And finally, in terms of when the bargaining power of buyers is strongest, it is strongest when the switching costs from one supplier to another, as we've established previously, are low. If it is very easy to move from one supplier to the other, the customer always holds the upper hand. Where if you do not give the customer exactly what they are looking for, you stand the risk of losing them to a particular competitor who is willing to give them what they want. So when all these factors we have discussed are at their lowest or in the opposite sense, then the relative buying power of the buyer will be weak. So if there are many buyers who purchase in small quantities, then they will not have that much of a strong bargaining power. If there are few suppliers serving a large number of customers, definitely their bargaining power will be low because the suppliers will dictate the terms. If the size of the buyers is small relative to the size of the suppliers, again, the suppliers will wield the power and therefore the bargaining power of the buyers will be low. And if switching costs are high, then it means that the suppliers will be the people in the position of power and the buyers will have very limited bargaining power. And with that, we come to the end of the discussion on the bargaining power of buyers. Now we move on to the bargaining power of suppliers. And in this regard, we are saying that organizations must obtain the resources that they need to carry out their activities from these organizations that are referred to as suppliers. And we know that in terms of the hospitality and tourism sector, there are various and different kinds of suppliers that supply all manner of resources to organizations, from human resources to equipment to daily inputs like food materials, drinks, cleaning materials, you name it. There are suppliers for all these in the hospitality and tourism sector, right? And by virtue of this, we can say that resources are obtained in markets where prices are determined by interactions between the suppliers and the organizations from the industries who use the resource. So at any point in time, if it is about purchasing cleaning supplies, the organization in question who wants to make the purchase has to identify the supplier of these cleaning supplies, who they want to work with, and then we'll go into an interaction, which we can call some form of negotiation, to determine the terms at which they want this supplier to supply them with these cleaning materials, how often, in what quantities, and so on and so forth, right? So in terms of the bargaining power of suppliers, it comes about as a result of the fact that many of the resources that are used by these organizations are in some cases used by more than one industry. So like the cleaning supplies we are talking about, they are not just used by the hospitality and tourism industry. They are used in the banking industry. They are used in the retail industry. They are used in the education industry. They are used in so many other industries, meaning that there's always competing interests or competing needs for these particular resources that are supplied. Apart from the other industries, even within the same industry, in different subsectors or in different organizations, there is a competing need for these resources that these suppliers offer. And as a result, we say that the bargaining power of suppliers will be determined by their relationship with the industries that they serve or with the individual organizations in the industries that they serve. So you realize that in, for instance, certain subsectors of the hospitality and tourism industry, you realize that in terms of suppliers, we have the cream of the crop, who are the top level suppliers who supply a certain level of high quality resource to certain organizations in that particular subsector. So for instance, Kwame, I don't know if you can help us with this. In terms of the hospitality sector, there are certain companies that supply certain products to certain hotels. Am I right?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
So you realize that you see the same suppliers' products in perhaps the 4-star hotel, but you wouldn't see it as you go further down into the other types of hotels.
Yeah.
Great. Right? So in that case, you realize that it is as a result of a kind of relationship that these particular firms have developed with this supplier, making this supplier exclusive to them. And this is the source of the bargaining power of these suppliers. So what are some of the factors determining the strength of the suppliers? The first one we can talk about is the uniqueness and scarcity of the resource that they provide. Like I said, you go to some of these 4-star and 5-star hotels and you realize that there are other generic versions of the same product in other hotels. However, when it comes to this particular hotel, that particular product or resource is more unique in terms of its design and how it has been positioned. or how it has been packaged, right? So for a supplier that is providing this level of a unique or scarce resource, they will definitely have a very high bargaining power in terms of negotiation and determining the terms at which they will supply these products or resources. Again, the strength of a supplier's bargaining power comes from the other industries using the resource. If there are other competing industries using the resource, it means that whatever it is that they are selling is in high demand. And whenever you are in high demand, you are usually very pompous and very selective because you have a choice and you can determine who you want to do business with and who you don't want to do business with and on which terms you want to do the business. So the more the industries in which that same resource from that supplier is demanded, the higher the bargaining power of that supplier. And if the switching cost between suppliers is very high, it increases the bargaining power of some suppliers because it is very difficult for a particular organization to jump from one supplier to the other to obtain the resources or inputs that they need. Also, the number and size of the resource suppliers determines their strength. If there are fewer suppliers of a particular resource serving a large number of industries or organizations, definitely their bargaining power will be high. And if there is a large group of suppliers or one large individual supplier serving a number of industries, in terms of their size and their level of influence, they'll definitely have a higher bargaining power when it comes to delivering that particular input or resource for the firms to use in their business operations. So these are the factors that determine the strength of suppliers in terms of various industries, and in this case, particularly the hospitality and tourism industry. So in that case, suppliers to an industry are likely to be the most powerful when the resource that they supply is scarce or unique. They are also likely to be more powerful if there are few substitutes for the particular resource or products that they supply. They are also likely to be more powerful when switching costs are high and when they supply the resource to several industries, meaning that there are various competing demands for the same resource that they are supplying. At the same time, suppliers are also likely to be most powerful when they, the suppliers themselves, are large, meaning that they are in a position to determine the terms under which they will supply a particular resource to a given industry or organization. And finally, they are most powerful when the organizations that are buying the resources from them are small. More especially in the case where the supplier is significantly large. They tend to bully the organizations that they provide these products and services as inputs to, leading to a high bargaining power among them. So in terms of the bargaining power of suppliers, we need to think about all these dimensions in terms of our strategy to be able to establish the kind of suppliers that are serving us, whether or not they have a high or low bargaining power, and how to be able to go around this in the event that it is a threat, or how to be able to utilize it in the event that it's an opportunity to the advantage of the organization to help achieve a sustained competitive advantage. Now, we have discussed four main dimensions of Porter's five forces model, starting from the threat of new entrants. We talked about the threat of substitute products. Then we talked about the bargaining power of buyers. And then we also talked about the bargaining power of suppliers. And now we are getting to the core of the model, which talks about the intensity of rivalry in the industry, often described to be the level of competition between the existing firms in that particular industry. Now, before we go further, it is important to note that this competition can be in terms of either price or non-price basis, such that firms will be competing among themselves in terms of how much they charge for the services that they provide. And for other firms, it's less about the price that they charge and more about the additional items or services that they offer. Remember, we discussed the different levels of the product and how firms can use the service provision at different levels of the product to distinguish themselves. Remember, we talked about the augmented product and the potential product and the extended product. These are all levels at which the firm can be able to compete on a non-price basis. Please, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, good.
Good. Yes, good. However, we realize that in terms of competition, the most overt way by which firms compete is on the basis of price. So if we go to the hotel industry, for instance, at the moment, they are all mainly competing in terms of price. How much they charge per room, how much they charge for their buffet, how much they charge for their various a la carte items, right? However, in terms of competing on the non-price basis, perhaps it may be the differences in menu, or the differences in service delivery, or differences in conflict resolution, or the differences in terms of the amenities that they offer at their different locations, right? So these are all aspects of price and non-price elements that firms or organizations in the hospitality and tourism sector can incorporate when it comes to competition among themselves. However, in some sectors of the hospitality and tourism sector, competitive rivalry is very fierce, while in others it is less intense or perhaps even non-existent, right? Since in some cases, what we can refer to as oligopolies and monopolies are formed, right? So in terms of oligopolies, they are a higher form of monopolies where we have two or more organizations that come together and hold some kind of distinguished control or higher level of control over the supply of a particular product or service in a given industry. Now, we say they're a higher form of monopolies because in terms of a monopoly, we have just one firm controlling everything, or one firm controlling the vast majority of what is happening in the industry. Whereas with oligopolies, it is two or more. So you can have two or three, about four firms coming together in some kind of alliance, and they exert the significant amount of control over the product and service delivery in that particular industry. Kwame, please come in.
Yes, Doc. A typical example is in the deep of the COVID. You realize that what government did, or government together with a few companies came together to produce sanitizers. So Casapreco, then what's the name of this company? This Angel Group.
Yes.
They are producers of Adonko.
Yes.
Then one major other one. So these three companies came together, okay, they were the three major companies that were supplying the Ghana Health Service with sanitizer, yes. And that trickled down. So those small companies were nowhere near them, and they were struggling. And I think that now because it's more in the market, they've just left it for them to do, and they are focusing on.
Yes, because I'm sure they have been able to reap much of the profits from that time.
Absolutely. I don't know, but let me put in this. You know, in the beginning, government wasn't. Government gave them some level of tax holidays with regards to VAT. They weren't taking VAT in the beginning. I think in the first from March to October. They weren't paying value. Yes, they weren't paying value added, and they made a lot of money. If you come to Casapreco, you see that they've really done a lot with progress with infrastructure. And this, my insider tells me, it was as a result of what they made during the COVID season.
The tax holiday, yeah. Wow, very great insights there. Thank you so much, Kwame. So based on this discussion we have just had, we realized that in industries and markets, particularly those highly competitive markets, where you can see that there's a lot of competition going on, it is important as an organization to have a system where you engage in regular and extensive monitoring of these key competitors. Because if you do not know what they are up to and what they are doing, it will be very difficult for you to formulate a strategy to be able to respond to their courses of action. So in that case, you need to monitor this particular environment, considering the intensity of rivalry among competing firms, along the lines of one, examining price changes, and then perhaps matching any significant move immediately. So you realize that in a particular industry, you see that all of a sudden one key player in the sector reduces their price, and then ultimately you see other firms will consecutively also reduce their prices. They may not bring it down to the same level as of this organization. Some may come to the same level, some may keep it a little bit above, and then others may go below the pace of the one who started the price reduction, just to make sure that they remain competitive. So you realize that particularly in other industries, for certain products or services, when you are consuming them from different industries, the price differences may be so little. And this is as a result of intensity of rivalry, being that firms want to remain competitive by not pricing themselves so far away from their competitors. They want to remain within the same ballpark, right? It may also include examining any rival products change in great detail. And this is where we marketers engage in things we refer to as mystery shopping, right? Where you will realize that in the case of the hospitality sector, if it is a particular product that a new hotel has introduced, their competitor will send one of their managers on a weekend stay to one of these hotels just to take in the scenery, just to monitor what this whole new product they are introducing is about, just to experience it into detail, to be able to come back and report back to their organization regarding this new service that their competitor is offering, what sets it apart from what they have now, and how their organization can respond by creating a new initiative to match what their competitor has created, or upgrading the services that they already have to become at par with what their competitor is offering. Please, I hope that makes sense. Kwame, please come in. Yes.
Well, please, a question. Is with regards to this context, is there a difference between mystery shopping and monitoring?
Okay, so monitoring is just, mystery shopping is under monitoring. Monitoring can involve mystery shopping and other means of establishing what your competitor is up to and keeping track of it. So mystery shopping is one of the ways by which we can monitor.
Okay.
So in that sense, mystery shopping is where you actually send one of your own people to pose as a buyer or to pose as a customer, to go and experience the product of your competitor the same way an independent customer would. The only difference here is that the person is working for you and giving you up to the second updates of the whole experience. The good, the bad, the ugly, the exceptional, they tell you everything. Now, this type of tool can also be used by the organization themselves, where they want to be able to test their own systems. So just like Porter's 5 forces model, mystery shopping is a general tool that any organization can use, depending on the objectives that they want to achieve. But the beauty of mystery shopping for competitor analysis is that you are using somebody that your competitor is not aware of and perhaps may never know was sent by you. I mean, please, does that make sense?
Yes, please.
So in that case, you will not send somebody that they know. Kwame will not go himself because they know Kwame is the marketing manager of so-and-so hotel. And they can easily spot him because the same way you are monitoring them, they are also monitoring you. So you also have to send an independent person that they are least likely to recognize, right? But in regards to what you asked, mystery shopping is one of the means by which we monitor the activities of organizations. Others will also have an independent informant. And it will shock you to know that, even in your hotel, I'm sure there's somebody who is informing your competition about what you people are doing in your hotel. So you realize that auditors will perform audits, and there'll be a lot of people on the payroll who do not necessarily work for the organization. And they'll sum it all up under market intelligence. That's the term we use for it. Kwame, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
We call it market intelligence.
What they see? What's also anything they see? Yeah.
Right. So these are all ways of monitoring, right? Where you are one step ahead in terms of knowing what is happening in terms of your competitors' moves, both internally and externally. Okay. Another means of monitoring includes watching investment in new competing operations. And this sometimes comes as a result of market intelligence, where they may not have actually done the investment yet, but based on your intelligence units, you have been able to identify that this particular competitor is about to make this level of investment, which will change the entire game in the industry. Like Kwame was the other day telling us about these 3 hotels who are market leaders in the hospitality and tourism sector, who are piloting these new technologies we were talking about when we were discussing the Fly Zoo Hotel example from China. Now, once they are able to invest in these new technologies, it is going to change the dynamic in the hospitality industry significantly. Kwame, would you agree?
I will agree with you.
Significantly.
Yeah.
So now that we know they are pilot testing it based on Kwame's intelligence, Kwame now has to sit down and strategize and say, okay, how can my firm compete with this? If we cannot compete with this, how do we respond such that we will not be so much affected by the outcome of this significant investment that they are making? Because definitely it will cause a change, and that change will affect all other hotels in that particular sector, right? So that is why monitoring involves watching investments in new competing operations by your competitors. It will also involve attempting to poach key employees. So if you are in a position to be able to poach the employees of your competitor, who you believe are the source of your competitor's key strategic position or competitive position in the industry, you can be able to do so. But you should only do so after you have monitored for some time and been able to clearly ascertain that this particular employee and their contribution to your competitor is what is getting them this competitive advantage that they have. And by getting them on your side, you will be able to perhaps get to par with your competition or overtake them using that particular employee's expertise. Mercedes, please come in.
Okay, please, I want to give an example here.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so with the Big Four, everybody knows that all trying to be the best. And I think it got to a point where Lloyd, and it was a big thing for them. I don't know if you remember they had that. So I think they wanted to break themselves up. So they ended up poaching people from KPM to and
wow.
I think now, oh yes, and they did poach a lot of people from PwC. You realize that they give you a contract that you wouldn't receive, so you quickly go because it's quite.
It's very attractive, huh? Yeah. You can't pass it up.
No. So that's what they did. I think now they are coming up.
Yeah. Smart. Thank you so much for sharing, Mercedes. Right. So that's a typical example of a strategic response to intense rivalry. Right. They've been poaching key employees, and there's no crime against that, especially since they are offering the employees better terms and conditions than they were receiving at their previous organization. So it's about the employee deciding whether to take it or not. Other employees would respond by not taking that offer immediately, but going to their current organization to ask them to match the offer of this organization that's trying to poach them. I've seen that happen in some scenarios as well. They will tell you that they have received this offer for them to leave you, and if you can match it or exceed it, they will stay. Some organizations will match it and have that employee stay. Others, looking at the terms, will say, well, we do not just have the means or the resources to match this offer, so you are free to go. Kwame, please go ahead.
No. That normally comes in when you know that you are very strategic in the organization.
Yes.
Yes. So for instance, if you are a team leader or a marketing director, you are the only person of that status that can come out to say that probably this is what I'm being offered. Nobody down there can just come and walk to management there. And you know, this comes with a cost. It's a big cost. The examples we are stating is a very big cost. If the organization does not have money, poaching is not an easy thing.
Yes,
so
it's not.
Your company should have been doing well and should be very daring enough to take up such risky decisions.
That's true. Very true.
Yeah.
Very true. Thank you for sharing, Kwame. All right, so let's look at some specific factors contributing to the rivalry among existing firms. One key thing we can talk about is the relative size of competitors. Like we know, particularly in terms of the hospitality and tourism sector, we have a whole range of firms in different sizes. Some are very large organizations, often with ties to multinational corporations, which gives them some degree of leverage and power in terms of competition in the industry. Whereas others are smaller organizations, mostly domestically owned, who do not have the gravitas that these organizations with multinational links will have. So that will determine the dynamic of competition in that particular industry or sector and the rivalry and its intensity between these firms at different levels. Another thing that we can say contributes to the rivalry is the nature of costs in the industry sectors. Again, it goes back to how firms are able to absorb these costs in relation to their resources. Some firms, by virtue of their size and the nature of the resources that they possess, are not able to give certain levels of service that involve certain high levels of cost or have high cost implications. Unlike larger organizations that can take on higher amounts of cost to provide certain levels of service to customers, right? Again, the degree of brand loyalty of customers. If customers are very loyal to certain brands, it reduces the level of rivalry and its intensity, because it means that once firms are loyal to a particular brand, they will consistently patronize their services over time, and it will be very difficult to get them switching to other brands offering substitute products or services. However, if customers are not very loyal, it means that there is always some level of ongoing competition to be able to gain the attention of these customers and get their custom. So that means that the competition and its intensity will be very high because the customers are not loyal. And today, one customer may be for one particular brand, and tomorrow they'll be patronizing the services of the other. Again, in terms of what contributes to rivalry, we can also talk about the degree of differentiation. If the products and services being offered have limited levels of differentiation, such that they are very similar to each other and are very close substitute to each other, then definitely the rivalry among firms in the industry or subsector will be high, because it means that they are offering virtually the same thing and must do extra work to convince potential customers that they are the preferred brand to provide the product or service that will satisfy the needs, that they have. So in that case, the intensity of the rivalry will be high. Whereas in the case where firms are highly differentiated, their products and services can be clearly distinguished from each other, the level of rivalry will be somewhat low because they are not offering the same thing, and therefore will not be competing for the same kind of customer. Again, we meet government regulation, which, based on how it is formulated and which kinds of firms it is favoring in that particular industry or subsector, can contribute to the level of intensity of rivalry in the industry. So if government regulation is such that it favors some organizations in that particular industry more than others, then the level of rivalry will be low, given that it places some organizations in more of a position to compete than others. Whereas if regulation favors more of a free market system where organizations are free to compete and find their own position and place in the market, the rivalry could be intense in the event that the firms are on the same level, at par with each other, and are competing for similar customers to offer the same products or services too. And then finally, in terms of the intensity of rivalry, we can talk about the height of exit barriers. If it is very easy for firms to exit, then the intensity of rivalry will kind of be low, because at the height of this competition, firms can decide to exit and focus on other markets. However, if the exit barriers are high, it will be very difficult for a firm to leave the market to compete in another market or industry, particularly when there are so many firms competing for the limited number of customers in the same market. And with low barriers to entry, it means that more competing firms will be entering the market at any point in time to compete with the already existing customers for the small market that they are all trying to serve. So in that case, if the intensity of the rivalry is high, no firm can leave and they are stuck in that market permanently. However, if the height of exit barriers is low, when the competition becomes such that they are unable to meet it, they will automatically exit and find another market where they believe they can effectively compete with the resources and competencies that they possess. So these are some of the specific factors that can contribute to rivalry in a given industry or market. So a high degree of rivalry will usually reduce the potential of profitability because, like I mentioned, it is the same group of customers that everybody is competing to serve, meaning that the few profits that can be made are being shared among a larger number of customers. So definitely the potential profitability that can be made from serving this market will continue to become smaller and smaller and smaller as more new entrants get into the market and as the rivalry and competition gets more intense. In that case, a firm will have to reconsider their strategy if they want to enhance their level of profitability, given the high degree of rivalry between the customers. So in recent years, many sectors of the hospitality and tourism sector have become more competitive as a result of the different factors that we have talked about. In fact, if not for COVID-19, which came and ground the entire industry to a halt, we would have experienced even higher levels of competition and rivalry among competing firms in this industry as a result of several factors and changes that were taking place, including technological advances, some of which we discussed in our previous session, and how it was going to change the entire sector. Another thing was also government deregulation and privatization, which had led to a lot of new entrants seeing the sector as now quite attractive and making significant investments into the sector to be able to benefit from the potential profits that can be made. The economic slowdown in many economies also contributed specifically to the degree of competitiveness in these particular sectors, including the hospitality and tourism sectors, because it meant that there was more competition for limited resources from limited numbers of buyers who were seeking a particular kind of product or service in the hospitality and tourism sector. And given that there was an economic slowdown, there was less money to spend. And therefore, the little money that buyers had to spend was being spent strategically. And firms had to compete intensely to be able to get a share of these revenue that was being generated from the sector, right? So these are all factors that have contributed to the intense rivalry in the hospitality and tourism sector. And these have become exacerbated with the onset of COVID-19. Given that a lot of the moves to make significant investments in the area of technological advances have somewhat slowed down for the hospitality and tourism sector in various geographic locations, right? In other locations as well, government deregulation and privatization has significantly halted, with governments now imposing significant restrictions, the first of which we saw were in terms of the lockdowns and the shutdown of major industries in these countries, including particularly the tourism sector in various countries. And the economic slowdown in many economies all over the world is significantly evident in its impact, not just on the hospitality and tourism sector, but on various sectors and industries in various countries, right? All as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So whatever few resources that firms have they are trying to use wisely to be able to earn the most levels of revenue that they can out of markets in an industry that is already struggling. And we are hoping that based on the forecast, within the next 3 to 4 years, the industry can return back to its former glory and perhaps pick up from where it left off in terms of these advancements, particularly in the area of technology and government deregulation and privatization. Now, we have been able to tout all the good parts of Porter's 5 forces model and how it is helping us to analyze the competitive nature of the hospitality and tourism sector. And we've established that even though it's referred to as the model establishing the competitive forces in an industry, it captures all the individual players in the microenvironment and the force that they possess and the power that they wield in terms of how they interact and how these interactions lead to changes in the microenvironment, which the firm must respond to in order to remain competitive. However, there are certain aspects of Porter's 5 forces model that we need to note, even as we are using it to be able to analyze the microenvironment. Now, the first of this is that although the model was originally developed with commercial businesses in mind, the framework also provides valuable insights for most organizations, destinations, or attractions. So in as much as we are using it for an industry level analysis, we can also bring it down to look at specific subsectors and specific markets, as well as in terms of hospitality and tourism, specific destinations or specific attractions to be able to determine the level of competition or the competitive forces that are interacting in each of these scenarios, to be able to aid the firm in establishing a correct and effective strategy to address the changes that are occurring at the different levels in these scenarios, including at the destination level, the attraction level, the market level, and the industry level, depending on how the firm wants to utilize it. Also, when using Porter's framework, it is important to identify which of the 5 forces are the key forces at work in an industry. And that is because even though we discuss all the individual forces like they operate at the same level in an industry, it is important to note that in every industry, you can have 1 or 2 or perhaps a higher number of forces being the key forces that are at work and determine the dynamics in an industry. So for instance, in a particular industry, you can realize that the suppliers are the ones that play the key role in terms of influencing the dynamic in that industry. In other industries, it could be the buyers. For others, it could be the competitors. So the firm has a duty to be able to conduct the right form of analysis to clearly establish which of the 5 forces is key in determining the changes that are taking place in their particular industry, market, or subsector. So just a quick one before we continue. In terms of the accommodation subsector in the hospitality industry, Kwame, which of the forces would you say is the key force at work? Is it the competition or the suppliers? Because I know the customers do not have any buying power.
Yeah. I think that we'll go for the accommodation.
No, in terms of Porter's 5 forces, which of the forces?
Okay.
I know there's no threat of new entrants.
Yes.
There's no threat of buyers.
Yes.
And there's somewhat of a threat of substitutes, right? There's a threat of substitutes.
Yes, there is.
Good.
There is because people can always go change. They can always change. Customers can always change if they see something that's not too good for them. I mean, they'll look, and sometimes they make a reservation. Someone decides to make a reservation, realize that the place is booked, and he decides to go elsewhere and finds that place more comfortable than where he is, or where he's always known.
Yeah. So can we say by extension that because there's a threat of close substitutes, there's also intense rivalry?
Yes, there is.
Good.
There is.
Good.
There is.
Good. Right. But I don't see an imminent threat of suppliers bargaining power, is there? Can we say that? Not really.
I equally don't. I equally don't think so.
Yeah, I think it's more of the substitutes and then the rivalry among existing firms in the sector.
Yes, because you see, with regards to suppliers, that difference is there. You know, there's a big difference between all the hotels. I mean,
yes.
Kempinski is up there.
Yeah.
Then the others, Movenpick, the Best Western, yes.
That's very true. That's very true. Okay, great. Let's look at another one. Events, Mercedes. Kwame, thank you so much for sharing. Mercedes, in terms of your sector, let's look at it and try to analyze it in terms of the Porter's forces model and see which are the key forces at play. Mercedes and Ruth, are you there?
Yes, we are here.
Okay, so can we say
we are here?
For you people there, it seems all the forces will apply. Threat of new entrants. Threat of new entrants. We have that one, isn't it? Yeah. Then we have threat of substitutes. That one too is there. Which will lead to intense rivalry. We already have 3 out of 5.
Yeah.
I don't see a threat of suppliers anyway. But I also see the bargaining power of buyers to be high because there are so many close substitutes and so many new entrants that the buyers are always spoiled for choice, meaning that their bargaining power will be high. So it seems compared to the accommodation subsector, events has it a bit more challenging. Mercedes, would you agree?
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Thank you for sharing.
Doug, when it comes to supply with regards to the events,
yes.
These days we have a lot of supplies in the system. So
it's serious,
yes. For instance, if it comes to let's say furniture with regards to events, a lot of different kinds of chairs are coming into the system. Different kinds of deco. We have a lot of deco supplies, and so if you are not supplying me what is trending, for instance, if you look at the canopies, Mercedes will obey me. There are new types of canopies and new types of materials.
Yes.
And so if you are not able to give me what is trending or what is there now, and I'm switching, I could easily switch. You don't have any else.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. So let's look at it from that direction. I mean, the suppliers with regards to events, there's some level of competition there.
Very, very true. Very, very true. Thank you for sharing, Kwame. So Mercedes and Ruth, you have your work cut out for you. Your strategy formulation must be solid. Okay. Also, in terms of aspects of the model we need to note, we also need to appreciate the fact that in many cases, it transpires that one or more of the 5 forces prove to be key forces. And the strategic analysis must focus on these if it is to use the framework fruitfully. So like we identified, looking at even specific subsectors of the hospitality and tourism sector, we realized that when it comes to events, the key forces there are more. And they have higher power as compared with the accommodation subsector. Meaning that when it comes to strategic analysis in the events subsector, managers then need to be able to focus on a higher or larger number of key forces than in the accommodation sector. And this means that they have to do more work to be able to use the framework appropriately to decipher the influence of these forces and how to be able to combat them in the case that these are negative influences and then to be able to benefit from them in the case that they see some opportunities to be had. Now, still an aspect of Porter's 5 forces to note, we need to understand that the dynamic nature of the competitive environments means that the relative strength of the forces in a particular industry will change over time. So today in accommodation, it looks like the suppliers don't have that much of a bargaining power, or the customers don't have much of a bargaining power. But with time, we need to realize that this may change. And the same goes for the event sector as well. Hence the importance of a continuous analysis, which involves continuously scanning the environment and monitoring the activities of all these forces within the environment. Because that is the only way that if there is a change in the strength of a particular force, you can be able to spot it in time to be able to adjust your strategy to respond to this change accordingly, right? So it is not enough to be able to do one complete analysis of all the forces at a point in time. It has to be done consistently to ensure that the firm has timely and relevant information regarding the changes that are taking place with regard to these forces on a continuous basis, so that they can be able to make decisions accordingly. Furthermore, we need to think about these forces as not just independent of each other, but also as groups that interact with each other, leading to specific outcomes, all of which can trigger certain changes that can affect our strategy formulation as organizations. So in as much as each of the individual forces engage in certain behaviors or actions, or wield certain powers that can affect the firm's strategic direction, the interaction between these forces as a group as well can also affect the firm's strategic direction. So these two aspects must all be incorporated in the industry analysis, such that you are not just looking at the forces individually, but you are also looking at them in terms of a group and how they interact with each other, all of which come together to determine your strategic direction as a firm. So that being said, what are some of the limitations of Porter's 5 forces model? The first one, which I believe we mentioned earlier, but I don't think everyone took note of, is the fact that the model tends to imply that suppliers, buyers, and competitors are threats. But you will bear with me that in some of the examples that we have given, we realize that in certain scenarios, they are not just threats, but are sometimes stepping stones to an organization's achievement of a competitive advantage, depending on how the organization views them and the power that they wield. So whereas one organization can be able to benefit from the strong bargaining power of a particular supplier to establish themselves as the market leader in a particular subsector, that same strong bargaining power of a supplier will be a threat to another organization in that same subsector. So in that case, contrary to Porter's 5 forces model portraying these actors as threats, we need to appreciate the fact that they are not just threats, but in some cases can also present opportunities, depending on how the organization views them and their position in terms of how their actions would influence their strategic direction, right? So in terms of formulating a collaborative or cooperative strategy, it is important that firms in the hospitality and tourism sector would incorporate some of these relationships and interactions between the suppliers, buyers, and competitors, depending on how they view that relationship or action, either as a threat or an opportunity, and harness it through a strategic alliance or a marketing alliance, depending on what best suits their purposes, to be able to achieve a competitive advantage. So don't just see them as a threat. See them also as a source of opportunity, which through collaborative and cooperative strategy formulation, you can be able to benefit from as an organization. Also, the 5 forces model implies that the 5 forces apply equally to all competitors. And clearly, as we have seen from our myriad discussions in class today, they in no way apply equally to all competitors. They apply very differently depending on the industry you're operating in, depending on your subsector, depending on your size and your position in terms of your competitors in that subsector, among others. So the strength of the different forces will differ from business to business, whether they are in the same industry or in the same sector or in the same subsector. And that is another key thing we need to bear in mind when it comes to applying Porter's 5 forces model. And again, we have been able to clearly identify all these limitations through our discussions, and we have addressed how we can be able to combat them to improve upon the effectiveness and the efficiency of our strategy formulation, right? So even though Porter's 5 forces has these limitations we have identified, like I just said, we have appreciated how to go about approaching these limitations in the application of the model and addressing it while we are formulating our strategy. So in essence, we are saying the model is a very good model to help us analyze our microenvironment. And this is evident in how influential the model has been since its inception in the year 1980 to date, in terms of being widely applied across various industries and sectors to help firms to understand their microenvironment and know how to formulate their strategies to respond to changes in this environment. So we need to bear in mind the different critiques that have been leveled against the model, even as we are applying it, and then use this to be able to help us fine-tune our strategy formulation based on the analysis we perform using the model, to ensure that we have addressed all these critiques and limitations to help us come up with an ironclad strategy that will make us obtain and achieve this sustainable competitive advantage that we are looking for. And with that, we've come to the end of our session for today.